Good afternoon, and welcome to our walking tour through the Bible. And we're now on step 261. Goodness gracious me. And we're going to be looking at chapter 7 of the prophecy of Jeremiah. I'm Father Alexander. This is St. Peter's in Hove. It's the feast of St. Joseph, by the way. But let's start with something totally different. You may have heard of the Luck of Troy. The Luck of Troy was an object that had fallen out of the sky. It was probably a meteorite. And it was kept in a temple in the citadel of Troy. And as long as the Luck of Troy was there, the city was impregnable. It could never be taken. There's a special word for one of these cult objects that falls out of the sky and becomes the object of intense devotion, giving a guarantee to the people who worship it. I've forgotten the name of that object, the special technical term for it, but there it is. Now, these things do exist even today, funnily enough. There are one or two places in the world where meteorites are regarded as special cult objects, and people go on huge pilgrimages to a place where a meteorite has fallen, where it's been enshrined, and so on. Now, that's the Luck of Troy. Then what, of course, went wrong was that Ulysses and Diomedes crept into Troy in the middle of the night. They stole the Luck of Troy, whereupon the Trojans despaired. And then later on, the siege of Troy, they didn't have this Luck of Troy, this divine talisman that would keep them safe. And so Troy was taken. It fell because of the wooden horse. We all know the story. I remember the story from when I was a tiny child, but it stayed with me forever. It's such a good story. Okay, now go to the prophet Jeremiah. It had happened previous to Jeremiah that Sennacherib had invaded, and then, if you remember, mysteriously the angel of the Lord had frightened Sennacherib away, and Sennacherib had suddenly withdrawn in the middle of the night and never come back again. The greatest military ruler of his time had been defeated before the walls of Jerusalem. Probably what happened is a plague broke out in Sennacherib's army. That's what they now think. Now, therefore, the Jews were under the impression that their city was impregnable and their city was guaranteed by God to last forever. The gates of hell would never hold out against it, in other words. The word of the Lord came to Jeremiah from saying, "Stand at the gate of the temple of the Lord and there proclaim this message." This is 7:1. Say, listen to the words of the Lord, you of Judah, who come in by these gates to worship the Lord. The Lord God of armies, the God of Israel, says this: amend your behavior and your actions, and I will let you stay in this place. Do not put your faith in delusive words such as, this is the sanctuary of the Lord, this is the sanctuary of the Lord, this is the sanctuary of the Lord. But if you really amend your behavior and your actions, if you really treat one another fairly, if you do not exploit the stranger, the orphan and the widow, if you do not shed innocent blood in this place, if you do not follow other gods to your own ruin, then I shall let you stay in this place, in the country I gave you forever to your ancestors of old. Look, you're putting your faith in delusive, worthless words. Steal, would you? Murder, commit adultery, perjure yourselves, burn incense to Baal, follow other gods of whom you know nothing, and then come and stand before me in this temple that bears my name, saying, now we're safe to go on doing all these loathsome things. Do you look on this temple that bears my name as a den of bandits? I, at any rate, can see straight, the Lord declares. And then he says, I'll make this temple as I'm like Shiloh, Shiloh being a ruin a few miles north of Jerusalem, which used to be the temple of the Lord until it was destroyed by, I think, the Philistines. Shiloh was where Samuel grew up, if you remember, the place where Eli was the priest. Shiloh didn't last. That was temporary. And he's saying this place, Mount Zion, that's not going to last either. But you, he's saying to the people of Israel, you have fetishized the temple. You think just because you've got the temple, everything will be all right. We can carry on as before. And therefore, the gates of hell will not hold out against us. And we can carry on committing adultery, burning incense to Baal, shedding innocent blood in this place, in Jerusalem itself. Now, this is really quite a terrifying passage. It would have terrified Jeremiah's hearers because he was saying to them, you think you are here permanently, that God has given you a promise, and that God will never withdraw his favor from you because the temple is here. But it's not as simple as that. Jeremiah is saying, you have fetishized the temple of the Lord. You have turned the temple of the Lord into some sort of human guarantee to yourselves, and you think this gives you a license to do exactly what you will, but it is not so. Now, we Catholics have been told by God himself, by Jesus Christ, you are Peter, and on this rock I shall build my church. The gates of hell will never hold out against it. Whatever you do, whatever you bind on earth will be considered bound in heaven, and so on. In other words, God has set up the church, and the church will never be destroyed. Now, this is absolutely true. The church will never be destroyed, but the church is spread throughout the world. The church of Ephesus no longer really exists. It was once a flourishing Christian community. I think there's an Archbishop of Ephesus, and there's also a church in Iconium. There is certainly a church in Ephesus. I've been there. There's no Christian community to speak of except a few expats. Again, the church of St. Augustine, the church in Algeria, the church in Morocco, the church in Libya. This has completely ceased to exist. There is no church in these places anymore. It was the Vandals swept in, and then, of course, the Arabs swept in, and they destroyed the church. It doesn't exist anymore. Bit of a salutary history lesson for us when you consider that the Church of North Africa was the church that gave us St. Augustine, but also St. Cyprian, St. Perpetua, and, of course, Saint Felicity. But it no longer exists. It's over. It's gone. And similarly to those people who lived to see the collapse of the church in those lands, it's still a bit of a mystery for us why the church collapsed in, let's say, in Tunisia, but not in Syria. People who lived to see the collapse of that church must have been mystified. How could this happen? We must not fetishize our Catholicism. We mustn't think that we've been given a guarantee by God and therefore we can carry on doing exactly what we like. We mustn't fetishize the fact that we've always had a parish church here, therefore we'll always have a parish church here. It'll carry on forever. Now, one of the things that Jeremiah does, he does seem rather anti-liturgical. Rather odd, but he does. One of the things about Jeremiah is that whereas let's say Isaiah talks about this mountain will be the place to which all peoples will come. My house will be a house of prayer for all nations, which is a very wonderful thought, particularly for us Christians. But Jeremiah is saying that you think you've got the temple and you'll have the temple forever, but you are mistaken. You think because you carry out the temple worship, therefore you can do whatever you like. Jeremiah is saying something that later our blessed Lord goes on to say, that unless you have a change of heart, unless you are pure in heart and mind, no matter how much temple worship you carry out, it won't avail you anything. Now, in other words, you must worship with sincerity of heart. Don't just pay me lip service, well, that is something that Isaiah said, but actually worship with the heart. And he says something very odd later on in chapter 7. He says this, add your burnt offerings to your sacrifices, eat all the meat. For when I brought your ancestors out of Egypt, I said nothing to them, gave them no orders about burnt offerings or sacrifices. Very odd, because as far as I can remember, and if you've been following this far, you can remember, the book of Leviticus is packed full of how to offer a sacrifice. That's all it's about, really. But of course, what he's saying here is that the covenant on Mount Sinai, the giving of the Ten Commandments, was an ethical covenant as opposed to a liturgical covenant per se. In other words, first comes the Ten Commandments. You've forgotten the Ten Commandments, and therefore, if you've forgotten the Ten Commandments, everything else is vitiated. My one commandment to them was this, listen to my voice, then I will be your God and you shall be my people. That's the original covenant. In everything, follow the way I mark out for you, and you shall prosper. The way I mark out for you is obviously the Ten Commandments. But they did not listen. They did not pay attention. They followed their own devices, their own stubborn and wicked inclinations, and got worse rather than better. So, in other words, it's the moral reformation that's really necessary here. And then, of course, if you go back to that was verses 22, 23. If we go back to verses 6 and 7, we have all the things that they've done which have violated the Ten Commandments. Here he says, "You treat one another. If you treat one another fairly, if you do not exploit the stranger, the orphan, and the widow, if you do not shed innocent blood." So, for example, clearly that is a reference to "Thou shalt not kill." If you do not follow other false gods, the first commandment, to your own, I shall let you stay in this place as well. But look, you burn incense about, you follow other gods, you commit adultery, you murder, you perjure yourselves, you steal. So it's clearly a reference to the Ten Commandments. I think we need to go back to the Ten Commandments. I'm a moral theologian, of course. I would say that, wouldn't I? But I'm actually saying it because I think it's true as well. We need to go back to the Ten Commandments. No amount of beautiful worship, and I strongly believe in beautiful worship, by the way. I strongly believe in the necessity of the God-given sacrifice that we have, the Holy Mass. But the first things first, let us learn to be good. Let us listen to the voice of the Lord. Let us learn to be good. There you have it, in a nutshell, of chapter 7 of the prophet Jeremiah. All the best. Bye.